All right, so this is my first time doing one of these, so, be kind. So we're doing a presentation today for the Baltimore Sitecore User Group on the Sitecore upgrade path. I'm Ken McAndrew. I should probably go to the introduction slide when I say that. The things we're going to discuss today, besides Kung Fu, we're going to do some introductions. We're going to talk about planning for an upgrade, some methodology that we'd recommend based on doing a number of these upgrades, going through code parts of the upgrade, the content upgrade, and finally, Jaina's going to talk about some of the top challenges you may run into throughout. So rather than saying that we know it, I always love that graphic. So introductions. My name is Ken McAndrew. I'm a senior consultant with RDA. Jaina Baumgartner is a digital strategist. I believe she will be joining us in a little bit. And Caitlin, did we want to try to go around the room and do introductions here?
I don't think people can join the audio, so that might be a little challenging. So we'll skip that. Okay.
So everybody just pretend that you introduced who you are. All right. I can't see the attendee list when I'm presenting, so I'm just going to say, hi, everybody. I don't even know if you can see my video when I'm presenting. Okay, so let's talk about planning for the upgrade. So if you've ever done a Sitecore upgrade before, it's not just the snap of the fingers. It's not a Windows update where you can say, run this, reboot, and you're done, good to go. I wish it was that easy, but it's not. The complexity of an upgrade and how much planning has to go into it really depends on what version are you on right now, how much content do you have to migrate, and up through the upgrade process. Are you using the Sitecore Analytics now, and do you want to keep that data? Are you using forms like web forms for marketers in version 8 and 7? Sitecore Forms was introduced in version 9, and it is a different animal. And then there are other considerations that we'll go over during the top upgrade challenges. But suffice to say, it does take a planning effort to do an analysis. So when we come in and we have a client that says we want to do an upgrade from Sitecore, whatever, to the latest version, we have to start with whatever your current version is and really get into what's installed, what packages are installed, how much content do you have, what does your code look like. And those things really determine how easy or complex these are. The older the version, as I noted, the more complex this is because Sitecore did change a few things as far as where the database is set up and where configs are located as time goes on. So we'll get into a little bit of the details on that here. So when it comes to the differences in versions, so for the analytics, it's evolved from DMS to XDB to now XConnect. And in the background, it's evolved from a SQL base, and then version 8 went to Mongo, and then version 9 started with SQL and then added Mongo later. But one thing you'll notice if you're doing the Azure Pass setup and you use the Azure Marketplace ARM templates, the default out of the box is going to be SQL Server. It's all Microsoft technology. Same for the search, will be Azure Search. Out of the box, it'll just give that to you. So if you want to change those things out, of course you can, but then you have to mess around with the connections and all of that and the configurations as appropriate. With the search, it's not that difficult. Analytics, I think, is a little bit trickier. But so typically now in version 9, we stick with SQL Server when we're doing it. With the infrastructure, we pretty much used to be there's a content management, a content delivery server, and then you could load balance your content delivery server, and you were good to go. If you ever look at a Sitecore 9, 9.3 as of today, of course, if you ever look at an install of that, like say you do an Azure Pass and you look at the number of app services there's content management, content delivery, identity server, a search server, Solar, Azure Search. There's XConnect, and XConnect makes up 6 or so different app services. You can add on the publishing service, which enhances Sitecore's native publishing and makes it a lot faster. Very good if you're doing a lot of geolocated content delivery servers. In 9.3, they introduced Horizon, which is the new version of the experience editor. That is a separate app service, and it requires identity server to be in place. So it's become a lot more distributed, and the newer stuff is more and more is .NET Core, but it's also pretty standalone. You don't develop against it. The base product is still today, .NET MVC, for 4.71 framework up to 4.8 framework. But just the number of different moving parts you have to deal with has grown quite a bit, especially once it went to version 9. From a component standpoint, and these are just the ones that are part of Sitecore are very connected to it. It was just a CMS before. Now you've got the EXM, the email experience. You've got JSS to do a headless service. You've got SXA for pre-built components. You've got commerce in there. And that's not even talking about, third-party connections like Salesforce, or if you want to enhance your search using Coveo, for example. It's grown again. Just the amount of things have grown. From a configuration standpoint, if you've ever dealt with I think it was Sitecore 8.1 this changed. It wasn't 8.0, but definitely in Sitecore 7. The Sitecore configuration was all in the web config. So the web config was huge. They eventually split that out to the Sitecore config. And then in version 9, they ended up taking the Sitecore-based configurations that were all in the app config include folder, which is where we all put things. And they finally moved it to its own location. So kind of isolating the out-of-the-box stuff, which is good for upgrade purposes. So now they're all in a separate spot. They also added roles in version 9, so you can specify a role that you're in, like you're on the content management, you're on a local server, you're on a QA or whatever, and you can configure based on that. And to support the Azure Pass, there used to be 2 folders: website, which had all your web stuff, and data, which was your logs and serialization packages. That got all moved under to the app data folder, so everything's in one, conglomerate now. From a code standpoint, Sitecore added NuGet support. That didn't exist until I believe 8.2. So you have NuGet packages now. They built their own version of dependency injection, or enhanced dependency injection. So that's built in and configurable and extendable. They added the Helix principles. We've gone from everything in kind of a monolith web project to now having, many different projects for a foundation layer, feature layer, project layer, and then how many ever you have in that. And that's just code. If you're doing this with TDS, add on TDS projects as well. So the number of projects per solution have grown if you follow the Helix principles. The upgrade path changed too. I mean, it used to be to upgrade, you'd have to go every major version install. So if you're on 6.2 and I've done an upgrade starting at 6.2, you had to go 6.2, 3, 6.4, 6.5, 6.6, and so on. Sitecore has really improved that, as we'll get into, and made that a lot easier, especially once you're at 8.1 and beyond, it gets a lot easier. But my first ever Sitecore project that I ever touched was an upgrade from I think 6.6 to 7.2, which so I had to go 7, 7.1, 7.2, and then I should mention you also had to install the updates. So you had to install update 1, update 2, update 3 to get to whatever the most recent is. So it wasn't just a snap of the fingers. So I kind of just went over this a little bit, but the major upgrade. But now you only have to get to 6.6 or 7.2. And I note that because the Express Migration tool that Sitecore created, they explicitly say you can start from 6.6 or 7.2. So if you're on 7 or 7.1, you still have to get to 7.2 to start. But the tool, the Express Migration tool was designed for these long back upgrades to get you from, you know, far back in time up to the most recent version. Now it still only goes to 9.0 initial, but from there you only have to get to 9.3. So and you only have to do it one jump. You don't have to go 9.1, 9.2, 9.3, which is good. But you do have to get to at least, you know, 6.6 or 7.2. The good thing is in the archives, you know, if you need to install a developer copy of the quote unquote source CMS, they do have all the way back to 5.1 available on the dev.sitecore.net site. I was digging in there because when I had to do that 6.2 upgrade, that was the earliest I could find. But ever since they've shut down the old version of that site and migrated everything to the current dev site to get the downloads, I noticed you can go all the way back to 5.1. I'd probably be a little bit scared to do that. I think you'd need at least a Windows 2008 server, if not maybe even 2003. I don't even know if the compatibility table goes back that far to tell you what it is. So anyway, so the migration tool though is available on dev.sitecore.net if you need it, if you're going from that far back. I think one thing to note here, especially if you're starting from this point, if a client comes to you and says, "Hey, I've got a Sitecore site that's, you know, this old," you know, you need to beg and plead with them to upgrade. We are dealing now where Sitecore 8.2, which was a pretty, I would say it was considered a pretty stable 8.x release, because they've gone all the way up from update 1 to update 7, and they never did a Sitecore, you know, 8.3 or whatever. They went right to 9. Those 8.2 sites are starting to fall out of mainstream support now. And that was only a couple of years ago. I set up a number of 8.2, like update 1, update 3 sites, you know, 2-3 years ago, and they're already failing out of mainstream support. So you can imagine anything from 6.6, you know, and back and all that, you really need to get upgraded from a technology standpoint, from, you know, a maintainability standpoint, support. You know, you've got to get those clients to upgrade those sites if they're not already. One challenge that we didn't mention that I'll mention here, because we're talking about this old, is that far back, you're probably also going to be dealing with ASP.NET Web Forms and not MVC. Web Forms are still supported to this day in Sitecore, but you're not going to find anybody that's going to recommend you do it that way. Maybe for some of the, if you're building some admin tools, because Sitecore's core, still you'll find .aspx files baked in there, web forms baked in there. They've done some things, I think, to MVC, but I got a feeling they're kind of biding their time and working in the background toward a .NET Core version at some point. But we'll find out. But one thing to account for is you're probably going to want to upgrade web forms to MVC as part of any upgrade from this far back. Once you get to 8.1, it gets a little bit easier. You know, you can jump from 8.1 over to, you know, I think you can jump all the way up to the most current version directly. Worst case scenario, you'd end up being able just to go to 9, but again, it's a 2-hopper from there, 9 to 9.3. Now, if you do a direct in-place upgrade, there are things you have to pay attention to in the upgrade guide. There are database schema changes, config changes, code that becomes deprecated. the infrastructure changes. If you're going from on-premises to an Azure PaaS solution. And I mentioned here Sitecore as a service because we're here in June, and the guidance that Sitecore put out, I think a year ago, was 9.4, and Sitecore as a service will be coming out sometime this summer. I assume it will be 9.4. There was a mention of version 10, but and I'll bring that up again in a few minutes. But to the best of my knowledge, the next version is supposed to be 9.4. So we'll see. The other thing with in-place upgrades, besides having to manage all of these changes, and Sitecore gives you a good guide for managing it. If something goes wrong, you better have backups. And with a Sitecore upgrade, the odds are something is going to trip along the way. Maybe the database gets stuck partway doing the upgrade package, or when you're doing it, the code changes. You have to account for those. So you're kind of playing a little bit with fire when you do it. I mean, if you want to do it on a development environment, sure. If you want to do everything kind of in place, but you could also trip into custom pipelines. Maybe they no longer exist, or maybe they're the configuration is a little bit different, and then you start getting yellow screens of death all over the place. So the methodology that we'd recommend when you do this is a side-by-side upgrade. So you leave everything alone that the client already has. So you don't have to worry about their site going down. The great thing is you can then compare the existing functionality to the upgrade. I would highly recommend when you're doing an upgrade project, unless you have to change something because of a search change or a code change, things like that, don't add any new features during the upgrade. Upgrade first, get that done, compare it to your existing site so that you can see apples to apples. Is the search results coming back the same? Especially if you're upgrading from an 8-point version that was still using Lucene. Lucene is gone. It was in 9.0. It was listed. It is no longer listed in the web config as a role option for search. It's out. Solar is the default. So if you're doing that, you may have to do some changes based on that. But then you can compare how your search results are coming in. And that way you can also account for going through and saying, well, okay, Solar is indexing things a little bit differently, and maybe that's why we get a slight variation of results. But if you're getting wholesale differences, then you'll be able to easily see it. All the new infrastructure, you can get it in place, fully test it, be good to go. Again, all the XConnect infrastructure has to be in place now, things like that. So knock on wood, when you're ready to do the final pull on this and change it, you should just have to repoint the DNS from the existing site to the new site, and you're good to go. You also then have an immediate fallback, because if something goes wrong, you can take the DNS, point it right back to the old site, and your old site is still up and running. So you've got redundancy and a safety feature. If for whatever reason the client says, no, this isn't working, whether it's some code that wasn't found, or you hit a load performance issue when the real world gets into it, things like that. There are ways to kind of mitigate. So when you get ready to start the upgrade, couple things to think about. You're going to want to branch off your code into an upgrade branch. So I'm assuming here you're using a Git model, whether you're using Azure DevOps or GitHub or something like that, where you have a true branching system, not so much the TFS model where it's kind of duplicated in a way. But so you have your master branch. I'd recommend below that a develop branch. Maybe that's your QA, your QA one. And then from there, you have one branch that's going to be your existing site. You're going to have the other branch that's going to be your upgrade code. So, you work in your upgrade, but unless somebody's put a development freeze on, you may occasionally have something changes in the existing site. You need to account for that. So that will let you bring the change in, or at least go in and see what the change was and bring it in manually if it comes to that. The other thing you need to think about, and I would think about it early because it's going to affect how you work with your authors, is content updates when you get toward the final cutover. If you're, especially if you're doing a database upgrade path, and we'll go into that in a little bit, you're going to want to set up a content freeze when it's time to do the final upgrade. Or if you're doing a, say, a beta site, you're kind of doing things like in parallel for a bit and letting certain people see the new site and work with it. You may need to maintain the code, or not the code, the content in two places, and that's an author thing. And you can also, remigrate, but it kind of depends on how much content are you transferring around per day. But thinking about those things early will help you get ready for when you do the final transition to your new upgraded site. So we'll start with code upgrades, which as a developer is the more of the near and dear to my heart. So there's a little bit more on this, and then we'll get into the content part of this next. So I try to separate these kind of into there's the code part, there's the content part. So starting with the code, as I mentioned first, you create the branch for your upgrade code to get started. You're going to want to pull out any of the hotfix DLLs. So if you ever had to go to support and they gave you a hotfix, or they give you a new version of Sitecore kernel, and they said, this is only for this version and only for this condition. I've gotten a few of those. Get them out. If you aren't using the Sitecore NuGet feed in the current project, you're going to want to dump out any of the Sitecore DLLs that you've connected to as well, because you'll have brought them in and put them in a library folder. So all of those will go out as well. And we'll get into more about the NuGet here in a minute. For your web config, do just get a default version. When I say a blank version, a default version of the web config from the upgraded site. So if you're going to 9.3, get the 9.3 web config. And you could use a comparison tool like WinMerge or things like that to compare and see where are your changes. I'm hoping you're using config transforms for your web config. My recommendation, if you've got changes, and I know the projects will change the web config at times, when you add DLLs and things, but as much as possible, use config transforms and don't touch the original web config. And that way, when you're doing another upgrade, you can just drop the new web config on top and then just check that the transforms still apply based on what's going on with the web config. I'll throw in the caveat here because eventually this will happen. That goes out the window if this goes to .NET Core, because then the structures are going to change somewhat. But for right now, that's going to be true. All right, so with NuGet, get the Sitecore NuGet feed into your NuGet config, and please make sure you use a NuGet config and don't just put it in Visual Studio. Otherwise, when you're doing builds, like CI/CD builds, it won't know where to get the DLLs from. And then get the appropriate references for that you'll need for Sitecore kernel, Sitecore MVC, analytics, etc. Whatever you need. As of 9.1, so from 8.2, and I think they later backdated to 8.1, I'm not sure, but as of 8.2, when NuGet was introduced, up through 9.1, Sitecore had two versions in NuGet. They had the original, the default, here's Sitecore kernel, and everything comes along for the ride that Sitecore kernel needs. And then there was the no references version because Sitecore realized people were annoyed by that and they just needed the DLL, just kind of like you did in the old days where you grab the DLLs, put them in the library file. But this way, at least you have a NuGet feed of it. As of 9.1.1, they got rid of the no references. I still not sure I completely understand why. I think it was something about maintainability. Maybe they had some issues when they stripped out the references. So now if you bring in Sitecore kernel, you will bring in every package it references. If you ever want to know how many that is, just start up a dummy empty MVC site and bring in Sitecore kernel and watch your packages config grow quickly. It will. So one thing to consider, and you'll see this a lot with Helix solutions such as Habitat or the Helix-based GitHub solution, is people are switching to the package references format. Now you have to do it manually. Web application projects, you can't just, it won't do it out of the box. But if you modify the CS_proj file and just add one in with the format, all of them will fall in that way. The nice thing is it will only show you in the project references the exact package you added, so Sitecore kernel, but all the sub packages are added in the background. So behind the scenes, you'll find them all, and all the references will be available to your code. So it makes it a little bit cleaner. It's, again, more quote unquote modern technique. If you are doing Helix and you get adventurous into the SDK project, which is more of a .NET Core type project, but you can use it with this, and I would recommend you check out the Helix-based GitHub project for this, because they've done a good job of it. I've actually been basing a lot of recipe work I've been doing on that project, but it has the advantage of being very clean, and in the references and the dependencies, you can actually kind of do a tree view of, well, here's Sitecore kernel. You can unfold it and see what's under it, and unfold it and see what's under it, and you can actually see by tree what all the different references are and follow them down as you need to. There are other neat tricks you can do with those things. I could do a whole presentation probably just on that. So maybe that'll be next time. Who knows? As much as you can when you're doing package references for the non-Sitecore stuff, I would recommend keeping the same version that Sitecore is using. For example, whatever version of, like, say, Newtonsoft JSON I'm using as an example here, because that's one that typically that Sitecore kernel will bring in, but typically we all are bringing it in separately for our own use. Use the version Sitecore does unless you've really got to use a different version for something. Again, that's just an ease of maintainability, because then you don't have to upgrade something separately. Everything's kind of out of the box. There are some solutions I've seen where they'll add the assembly list from the Sitecore. The Sitecore's got a CSV list of all the assemblies, and they'll actually put it into publishing to go ahead and skip publishing any assembly that belongs to Sitecore, so you're not always having to publish Sitecore kernel and things like that. Newtonsoft JSON is going to be one of those. You can always exclude that, of course, but if you did something like that, you'd have to build in those exclusions. So again, just a recommendation. You also, of course, want to upgrade the other packages like GlassMapper. If you're using that for an ORM, you want to upgrade those as well. One note: GlassMapper switched in version 4 to version 5 to a by version Sitecore. So there's a GlassMapper 5, 9.1, 9.2, 9.3. So you will need to kind of you can't just upgrade it. If you're upgrading the version, you need to kind of pull it out and put it back in. So quick little caveat with that. And I mentioned GlassMapper specifically because that is, I find, the most popular ORM that people use. So I'm using that as a specific example here. I know there's synthesis, and some people will just go ahead and use the good old, Sitecore out of the box APIs. Whatever methodology you use in that case. For the config files, if you're using Slow Cheetah to do transformations, and I'm not talking about the web config here because the web config transforms by default are built into to the Visual Studio, but using Slow Cheetah to do transforms of your other config files, you want to change those out for the role-based configuration. So if you go in the web config, you'll see the roles that are already defined: content management, content delivery, indexing, reporting, etc. You can add any role you want to that. So I always add one for the environment, local, QA, stage, prod, whatever. But it should get to a point where the only file you need to transform is the web config. And that's just mainly to define the roles. There are other changes you probably don't do to the web config, but the biggest one is to define which role are you using. The exception to kind of the roles and the patch file world of config files is anything that's on the root of app config. I used to include connection string files. There were only 3 or 4 of them. Now the connection string file is huge. I recommend you do not include that. If you have custom databases, I would just apply them to each environment manually and just do it that way. If you are, there are other ones like the layers, with the new layers config, which tells it what order to kind of bring things up. There is a security setup that to add domains, you can actually patch that. You don't need to modify that domain file. I'd say 90% of the time you probably don't even need to touch those, or have them in your project. So you can just deal with the patch file ones. So something I'm going to bring up here, and I've told people that I jokingly threaten them with cutting their hands off. If you got the Sitecore config in your solution, I want you to remove it and forget it exists right now. Just, it's gone. It's out of there. You use the patch files. Use patch files to do the app config. This now also applies in my mind to anything under app config/Sitecore, which is where Sitecore does their default configs. The app config include folder, which for years had all those Sitecore configs and your stuff could get lost in it, has exactly one folder in it by default. It's called examples, and everything in there is disabled with .example or .disabled. It's all just, how do I do this? How do I do that? Ideas for doing configs. Sitecore config, don't touch it. Anything under app config Sitecore, don't touch it. Just override it. The layers config I mentioned earlier, those things are always at the top. So anything you put in the app config include, regardless of the name, because it used to be, it'd be app config include and then alphabetically under that and then subfolder, etc. You can control that with the layers, and it's already set up for you so that the app config Sitecore will come first, then the app config include, and it even will build in foundation feature and project layers for you in that order if you're doing the Helix models. So you should never have to modify those files manually at all. Again, think about future upgrades. You don't modify them, you don't have to go looking for them. You don't have to worry about Sitecore changes something. Then you just have to worry about your little patch file and not a gigantic file they may have done. So now the fun part, fixing the code. So when you upgrade, especially if you're going from further back, you're going to run into broken code, code that's been marked obsolete, and code that's been marked as deprecated. I use ReSharper daily. Visual Studio, as they've been increasing, in their version and their capabilities, is getting closer on par with what ReSharper offers. And I mess around with it. But it's always handy having that little counter in the bottom right corner that says how many errors on how many pages, and be able to click it and jump to the next error and jump to the next error. I think Visual Studio has something native to that, but it's not really across pages, at least that I found. I don't claim to be a Visual Studio, sensei on this. But even if it's just like a temporary thing for this project, I'd recommend at least one person have that for, being able to go through and identify, things that have popped up. If you can, try to handle the deprecated code immediately, like during the upgrade process. Deprecated means of course, it's marked as deprecated, and it means it's going to be eliminated at some point, but at what point, we don't know. You can always go back and get it later with Visual Studio, ReSharper. As time permits, you should address it. The best example I can think of, Site GlassMapper 4 used the Glass controller and GlassView to kind of shortcut stuff, get you right into GlassMapper's functionality, be able to do like shortcuts like @editable rather than @html.glass.editable. As of version 5, those got deprecated, but they still work right now. The last I checked, those will still work as of today, but they are marked deprecated. And nowadays it's just a standard controller, and it inherits in the view, and you do use the @html.glass.editable like you would do @html.sitecore for placeholders and things like that. Unless you've got a very generous timeline, and this kind of goes back to a point from earlier about adding features, I wouldn't recommend trying to implement Helix principles during the upgrade if you're dealing with a non-Helix project. You've got, you're going to end up going from one kind of Uber project to multiple projects. And, that kind of refactoring is going to take a lot of time. You're going to need to think about the layers of the projects. First, you're going to need to get familiar with Helix if you aren't, and then getting into a foundation layer, feature layer, project layer, which code goes where without violating the principles. That's all really beyond the scope of an upgrade. So get yourself up, as I noted earlier, get up to the current version, then go back and consider that kind of a refactor. You may end up rewriting things wholesale at that point because you start getting into the code, and you start going from a couple of years ago and you're like, what was I thinking? I know I've done that as I go back and do support on some projects. I go back and it's like, what was I thinking when I wrote that? And it's like, well, I was thinking that I knew then. I wish I knew then what I know now. And sometimes things get rewritten if the opportunity exists. But we have what we have at the time we have it. So you can get into the refactoring, but I would again hold off on that until a later point. Or if the client is like, we're going to upgrade to 9.3, and then we're going to consider doing like a whole overhaul, that's the perfect time to do, get the Helix if you're going to do a full-on overhaul of the system. So getting into content upgrades now, there's really two methods outside of the in-place upgrade, which when I say in-place, I mean you're taking your exact environment and you're just running the upgrade scripts against it. So if you only got a small amount of content and just a few media items, you could serialize that content with TDS, with Unicorn, or the direct Sitecore serialization, and just bring it all out and put it into the new site directly. Just, sync it down, sync it back up to the new version. Pretty straightforward. More likely than not, you're going to have a lot of content, especially, if you've got a ton of media, a lot of, PDF files, basically a lot of things that wouldn't be in your source code. Your source code is going to have your templates, your layouts, rendering, settings, things like that, but not necessarily the entire content tree that's in production today. So you're going to do the Sitecore upgrade, but you're going to do it against only the databases, and then you're going to do it against a copy. So for doing that, for doing the content part of the upgrade, setting aside the analytics, if you're going to be upgrading those, for doing just the content part of this, you only need to back up core and master. Those, I believe those are the two you would need to deal with. Web forms for marketers, if you're coming from 8 up to 9, there is a separate upgrade for that. Analytics, there is a separate upgrade for that. So again, we are just dealing with the CMS content tree. Core has got your settings and edit buttons and users. Master, of course, has all your content. You don't need the web database because you publish from master to web and you've got in your gold already. So back up your core and master, install a version of the existing site. So let's say we're going from 8.2 to 9.3. Install 8.2, you got your backups, replace the core and the master out of the box. So now you basically have an empty 8.2 site with the content from your client. Run your Sitecore upgrade process at this point. So, how many ever times it's got to be done, as I said, 6.2, you're going to do 6.3, 4, 5, 6, and then express migrate up to 9 and then jump to 9.3. If you're on 8.2, you probably can get right to 9.3. Worst case, you get to 9.0 and jump to 9.3 from there. And then use the upgrade manuals, for every version you're going through. Just keep checking the manuals and the scripts. Sometimes you have to apply SQL change for schema changes ahead of time. Like they'll tell you to do that first, and then you go from there. I will say that when I did the 6.2 to 8.2 upgrade for a client, especially because we had to start at a Windows 2008 virtual machine for purposes of the upgrade, because that's what the version of Sitecore you needed, or version of Windows you needed for that version of Sitecore. From a safety standpoint of checkpointing, we basically did the 6.2 to 6.3 upgrade and then made a snapshot of the VM. Then we installed 6.3 clean, attached to databases, 6.3 to 6.4, and we just kept doing that process. So you could do that, and that would save you having to go through at least like config changes and things, because there will be config changes along the way just to get even that default site working. I believe Sitecore does provide a zip file with all of the appropriate changes, so you can kind of work from that. But that's a way you could also do kind of checkpointing. So if you get the 6.6 and something's going wrong, you can back up to 6.5 if that was working fine. What happened? Things like that. Again, a lot easier if you're going, in the more modern versions. You can just quickly jump up. Get your new infrastructure set up. I'd probably say 95% of the time it's going to be Azure PaaS, 5% on-prem. That's just my experience. I've seen 2 projects, one of which I've done that was an on-prem Sitecore 9. The rest have been, Sitecore Azure, or not Azure, Azure PaaS. So once you've got your upgrade, back up the core and master databases, put them on top of the upgraded version. So now your core and the master databases are sitting there ready to go. So now you have a dummy version of, let's say, 9.3 with the appropriate databases, and we're ready to go to the next step, which is put the code and the content together. So you've got your blank upgraded Sitecore site, you've got your updated core and master. Make sure you can log in and see the correct content. Once or twice I've done it, you have to do an IIS reset. This is locally, or restart the service. You push out your upgraded code to the new site, and of course, everything works just like magic. Okay, if you believe that, I'm going to sell you a bridge. In reality, it's going to be more like this. Everything's fine, nothing to see here. This isn't a scare thing. This is just the reality of the situation. You're probably going to run into errors. You may have a conflicting code package or a configuration that got missed during the process. If you're going to version 9, role configuration, they may be a little bit out of sync or out of order. For example, when you're going through roles, they're going to stop processing on the first match. So if you set a role for content management, it's going to stop on the first one that's anything with it got content management in it. You can be a little more precise, content management and prod, to say this is a content man. It's got to be content management and it's got to be production. So if you're doing content management and stage, for example, you can do a different one. Site definitions are a good idea for that. So you may run into something like that. Pipelines and events don't fire as you would expect anymore. Things like that. This is probably one of those few times where you want to see the yellow screen of death and get yourself into the Sitecore logs to figure out what's going on. You can even add custom logging around it. I've kind of started adopting, it still uses Log4net, Sitecore's default Log4net, but kind of adopting a separate logging process that puts everything into my own log file and it will log it to Sitecore's logs as well. So you kind of get a double whammy on that, which might seem like a little bit of redundancy, but especially when you get to Azure Pass, you've got App Insights, but sometimes you just want to get into the Kudu and look at the log files. And Sitecore's logs, they kind of smush everything into one log file. So there might be an advantage to having your own log file for your own custom code. That is your choice, of course, however you want to play it on that. If you need troubleshooting assistance, reach out to Stack Exchange. Sitecore Stack Exchange is a great place. The Sitecore Slack channel, the URL is to the invite. It is an invite process. Use a search engine. There's tons of blogs on upgrades, installations, things like that. When all else fails, get a hold of support, especially as you get into some of the more esoteric areas like analytics. You might run into issues with certificates, things like that, with getting analytics working with all the various sites, and you may need help. And then all the SEALs will come and hug you. All right. So at this point, I'm going to switch. I'll go ahead and keep driving, Jaina, if I can. Can you, Jaina, are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I hear you.
Awesome.
Want to make sure. It's like, do we need to switch this to you driving or not? But I'll drive if you want to speak, and I'll let Jaina take over from here.
Sounds good, Ken. Thank you. And please feel free to chime in as you see fit with this. So I'm going to discuss the top upgrade challenges that I've seen and also found in my research. I wanted to come up with 10 to do like a countdown from 10, but I'm sure there are a ton of upgrade challenges, but I wanted to focus on the biggest ones. So I found 8, so we're just going to do a countdown from 8. All right, so the first one is the Sitecore 9.x has better performance, but slower startup with things like content editor, experience editor, forms. So the best thing to do is load up a warm-up script as a starting point. And here is Jeff LaRue's warm-up script to get it going.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that, Jaina, is I've heard from we've had people comment about the performance with 9.1 and 9.2, and Sitecore and MVPs have noted 9.3 was a big development change, or not a performance upgrade. So, getting to 9.3 may help you with performance, but yeah, there's just so many parts that a warm-up script is almost essential these days.
Yeah. All right, so you've already covered this quite a bit, Ken, but just to touch on it, number 7 is there is a lot of new infrastructure with Sitecore 9 and obviously an Azure Pass consideration. So the best thing that you can do, there's a shift from MongoDB to SQL for analytics, Xconnect added, Solar or Azure Search, and then SSL certificates required. So the best thing you can do is read up on Sitecore's infrastructure before you go into the upgrade process and make sure that you have all of the prerequisites as well as all of the servers or services necessary in order to spin up a Sitecore 9.x instance. All right, compatibility issues. So there'll be a ton of compatibility issues as you upgrade your code base with new libraries. But again, you already touched on that, Ken, in terms of, how do you get through updating all of your references. But a few big things of note is there's a new dependency injection framework. So just make sure that if you have written your own, or if you're using your own dependency injection framework, you may have to use Sitecore's or one that is compatible with Sitecore's. And then system.identitymodel.tokens.jwt, Sitecore, at least in 9.0, I'm not sure about the newer versions of Sitecore, used an older version of the model. So if you are already using the model, you can definitely run the newer and older assemblies at the same time. All right, deprecated libraries, there's a bunch of these as well, but one big one is proxy disabler. So if you have any occurrences of proxy disabler, you need to remove them. And here's a link of all the deprecated changes from Sitecore 9.3. So everything that has been deprecated so far, you could take a look at that to really read up on everything. But I just wanted to point one of those things out. Third-party modules. So this one is a really big challenge for any Sitecore upgrade. Before you go into an upgrade, you do need to look at all the third-party modules that you have in your instance, and are they compatible with your upgraded version of Sitecore? So the first thing to do pre-upgrade is make a list of all those modules, then decide what are you actively using. You might have to poll your users, talk to them, and understand what are you using and what can be deprecated. And then figure out if you can find the latest versions of those modules on Marketplace or GitHub. And if you can't, contact the creator for the latest version. The other options are that I've had to do in the past is look for similar modules, or even potentially rewrite portions of the code, or decide to pick a version. Pick a version of a module that's compatible with, basically compatible features with the module that you're using. All right, search, I've lost count, so I have no idea what number search is. But the challenge is Sitecore's moved from Lucene to Solar. And then Ken, you mentioned, you found this, right, that Azure Search was scheduled for deprecation in version 10?
Yeah, I won't claim to be the one that found it. It came up on a Slack chat, and a bunch of people were like, what? And then I went and looked at the 9.3 install guide, and buried in there, it does note Azure Search is scheduled for deprecation as of Sitecore 10. And so I mentioned earlier, I assume 9.4 is the next one and not 10. As a note, the Azure Search, I guess, like I mentioned earlier, is out of the box install with the Sitecore Pass ARM templates, but a lot of people stay away from it because the biggest reason it's got a 1,000 field limit, and Sitecore has gone through in the configs for search and disabled as many of the kind of the default fields as it can to reduce that. But the minute you want to do a multilingual site, any number of fields you have is automatically going to be multiplied by how many other languages you're doing, and you will probably quickly hit that 1,000 field limit. So, Solar still becomes the item of the day when it comes to this. If you're just using kind of the free or out of the box stuff, so either a VM that runs Solar or something like SearchStax, which has a relationship with Sitecore. Right. Even if you're using Coveo for your front end search, don't forget that the content editor will use the master and web indexes, depending on where you are, like if you're on the Sitecore desktop, in the back end. So if you want to be able to find content, if you have a lot of it or a lot of fields, you're still going to want to maintain a good relationship with your default indexes. So I wanted to make sure to call that out. So if you are doing any kind of upgrade planning, I would heavily consider your search options if you're thinking of using Azure Search. That's, again, personal experience. Solar doesn't pay me. They don't pay anybody.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So, if assuming you're going with Solar, the config structure has changed, so you'll have to upgrade any custom index configs that you have, and I've attached some examples. There is a default limit for the query.max items at 100, and honestly, you shouldn't be going above that anyways because, it's going to affect performance. And then config changes should only be applied to CM and standalone servers, so make sure that you use that via roles. All right, so forms. With Sitecore 9 and above, Sitecore introduced the concept of their own Sitecore forms and have moved away from WFFM. So I found a few conversion tools for WFFM. Now, WFFM did have a lot more features or different features than Sitecore forms. So here's a forms extensions in the marketplace or on GitHub that you can use to get a lot of those features that WFFM had, assuming you're using those features. And the conversion tool does use this form extensions plugin. So basically, it will convert those WFFM features that Sitecore Forms doesn't have out of the box using this plugin. All right, then I think one of the biggest ones is analytics, because XDB has been replaced by XConnect and MongoDB has been replaced by SQL. So analytics basically has been redone at the core. So what can you do as you're upgrading? Some of the options is look at trimming your data, or even if possible, just archive your data and view it as an archival dashboard. If you can avoid upgrading analytics, try to avoid it basically. And remember, analytics data after a while, you're going to collect the new data, and the new data is what's going to be important over time anyways. So think about options here other than moving the data. But assuming you can't, and that data is very relevant and very used by your client or your business, there are ways. So first, if you're going from Sitecore 8 to 8.1, you'll have to run the hash stored IPs tool. And then 8.1 and above, there is an XDB migration tool. Some things to make sure is the migration, especially if you keep all the data and don't trim it, can take days. So make sure that you've prevented regular app pull recycles, and any custom analytics that you've written. All of the namespaces and pipelines have changed, so you will have to rewrite all of that code.
Yeah, and I find a lot of people will double up, and they'll have Google Analytics in play as well, almost invariably, because it's more familiar. They do have different purposes. I mean, Google Analytics gives you a lot of good data, but from a personalization standpoint, Sitecore Analytics are what you need if you really want to get deep into that, and profile cards. Yeah, I would say reach out to Caitlin if you're interested in some work that RDA has done on Sitecore Analytics and Google Analytics kind of working hand in hand. We actually did a presentation at the last symposium on this. So I believe there is a workshop that can be set up if anybody's interested in that. So I'll just throw that out there as well.
Yeah, and yeah, so just talking through that as well, Ken, so you having done strategy around Google Analytics and Sitecore Analytics, you're absolutely right. Most clients have both those tools or some other analytics tool, even if they have Sitecore Analytics turned on. And one of the things I always tell my clients is that Google Analytics is really great at attribution modeling and collecting traffic data, and then generating data with ad campaigns. And Sitecore is amazing at the concept of engagement and engagement value. So Google is more for how to bring people to your website, how do you attract people to come to your website, and Sitecore is more about how to keep them on your website. So that would be the distinction. But yeah, when you put them together, there's quite a bit of magic that you can create.
I already used that graphics. I can't use it again. Probably, I'm sure there are different ones, but anyway.
So we do have a question, and if anyone else has questions that is on, make sure you guys put them in the Q&A section. But we have a question from Brian that says, have you used the Sitecore Upgrade Center that was introduced with Sitecore 9? If so, how useful have you found it, and in what scenarios would you use it?
I haven't personally used it. mainly because most of the upgrades I've done have been from the 8.x prior world, not within the 9 world. So I mean, I've heard of it and I've seen a little bit of it. So there might be some value there, but I'd say the caution is if you use it, you are essentially doing an in-place upgrade. So you do have the potential of, you know, a data failure or whatnot. And I don't know how easy it is to back up app services. Yeah, I think there's a way to do it. I'm not unfortunately, I'm not an Azure guru, but you would need to consider that before you use the Upgrade Center to do that. I think the Upgrade Center also does like some of the marketplace packages as well. There's some value there if they. This is if I'm correct on this, but I just always caution when it comes to upgrades to have that backup plan. If your backup plan is, you know, a backup of the site, then great. You can go for it with the Upgrade Center. But I feel like the closer you get to the production run of it, the more cautious I want to be. And actually, I think deployment slots might come in handy there, like you know, blue-green deployments, things like that. With the deployment slots with that Azure offers, you could, you know, do your upgrade version in a separate slot and then you know, run the center there. But you do also run, you know, deprecated code possibilities, things like that. Not probably as much as you would from the 8.0 world, but again, with Upgrade Center, you're dealing with 9. You're in 9. Again, 10 being this mythical thing that none of us know what it is. You know, and I'm not privy to any MVP information, and if I was, I don't think I could tell you. So I don't know what is on the books for 10. The only reason I say version 10 is because of that Azure search thing I found in the guides. So those are my thoughts.
One more question. Do you know what the licensing process is while upgrading? If we wanted to run a side-by-side upgrade, then cut over the DNS after the new prod site is ready, would the client need to carry 2 times the licenses for however long the upgrade process takes?
That gets into a legality question that I don't know that I could answer, and I would probably recommend you talk to your sales rep.
Yeah.
That said, I mean, Sitecore's licensing system is not such that it will necessarily shut you down. It doesn't have like a ping back that I know of to say, are you doing your licensing correctly? It's usually when you go through and you're doing an audit of how many servers do you have up that you realize, oh, you're kind of over your licensing limit. And it's happened, and we've had to have people shut down some servers because of that. Given that it's an, you know, again, non-legal advice here, given that it's an upgrade, you know, you're going from, you know, one version to another, and thus, in theory, you are not in production until you switch over that DNS. I would say you're probably okay to do it. I would just make sure that when you get to the end of the process, you're back into compliance with whatever your license is. So if you set up, say, a dev, local environments out of the picture here, of course. If you set up a dev, a stage, and a prod environment, and you really only have a license for a staging and a prod, you know, then get rid of your dev environment and just go back to what you should have from a licensing standpoint. Again, disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, and this is not valid legal advice. This is just my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the same thing, just personally, again, not legal advice by any means, but this is like licenses have never been an issue, and most companies have just as many licenses as they need to run the system. So Sitecore is pretty, I mean, work with your sales rep, but they're usually pretty okay with letting you upgrade. They want you to upgrade. So they're going to be okay with this. But just make sure that, I think a few things to remember is that you're going to do most of your work in local and non-prod, not in production. So for the most part, you should have, two production. Well, technically, you would never have two production instances, but having two production instances is going to be for a very small period of time, right? So they'll work with you to make sure that works. Like they're not going to that I've seen, they don't really penalize you with additional license costs.
Yeah, the only other caveat I could think to that, and this is still pretty new territory for Sitecore even, is with Docker. I'm seeing a lot of people starting to switch to Docker for doing development work, and even some for doing the actual environments. I believe that will fall under. I mean, that should fall under the same licensing category because your Sitecore instance is still your Sitecore instance, no matter how it's presented. Right. But that's kind of Docker has kind of become the new hotness when it comes to Sitecore development. Instead of like spinning up a local VM, you spin up a Docker instance. So it's it should be 6 of one, half dozen of another. But if you're ever concerned, you could certainly reach out to your Sitecore sales rep and check with them. Safest bet.
And Tom also put in the chat that Sitecore will work with the client to not double charge them. So that is all the questions that we have. Thank you guys so much for presenting. That was awesome. And thank you guys for everyone that was attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.